Good morning, everyone. This is the meeting of the panel on financial affairs on the 7th of April. It's already the appointed time, 9:30. I now declare the meeting to order. First item, confirmation of minutes of the last meeting and matters rising. Minutes of the meeting held on the 2nd of December 2013 have been circulated to members via paper number CB-1981/13-14, and the Secretariat has not received any proposals for amendments so far. So, Mr. Jeffrey Lam, do you have any comments? If not, then may I propose that we confirm the minutes? All right, no objection. So minutes confirmed. Thank you. Information papers issued since the last meeting. I'd like to draw members' attention to this. That is, since the last meeting, we have issued a total of 3 papers, and the details have been set out in the agenda. So please note that 3 papers have been issued. The first is fourth quarterly report of 2013 on employees' compensation, insurance, reinsurance coverage for terrorism. That's paper number CB-1890-01, and quarterly report of the Securities and Futures Commission, October to December 2013, paper number CB-1013, and also press release on reappointment of the Chief Executive of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. And date of next meeting items for discussion, we have 4 proposals. Number 1, a briefing on the work of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. Number 2, Mandatory Provident Fund Schemes Amendment Bill 2013. And 3, public consultation on the reform of the regulatory regime for listed entity auditors, and also annual briefing on the work of the Financial Reporting Council. So, any comments on that? So, if that's the case, then we will confirm that. And the third item is about a review of abscondee regime under the bankruptcy ordinance. So, please mark that down on your diary. So the next meeting will start from 9 o'clock, and according to the Secretary, we will only be able to end by about 1 p.m. So please make sure that you jot that down in your diary. So the next meeting will be held on the 5th of May, 9 to 1. Without further ado, I'd like to invite the administration team to join us, because item 4 is a briefing on the report of the Working Group on Long-Term Fiscal Planning. Yes, I'll be reminding him to be brief. I'll give you more time to discuss this, and if you think that you still have further comments to make, then I will set aside further time for another meeting. Well, probably we won't be able to deal with everything in one meeting. Professor Chen and your team, welcome to the meeting.
係陳局長同埋咁多位。
Yes, Professor Chen. Well, some members are concerned that if it's a 54-page PowerPoint presentation, it's going to be quite long. So can you be a bit more precise and concise in your presentation? You don't need to go through each and every PowerPoint slide with us. So when you're ready, you can get started. All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank the panel for arranging this meeting, so that the working group is able to brief you on the salient points of the report. Since the release of the report on the 3rd of March, we have had a lot of discussions on this, so that the public will be able to discuss this very important issue of our fiscal or financial sustainability, so that there can be more in-depth understanding of the issue. And I would also look forward to a more in-depth exchange of views with members on this report. First of all, we have engaged actuaries and also experts to come up with long-term plan to cater for the long-term commitment as a result of our aging population. We have looked at objective data. We have also looked at the demographic changes, and we have come up with projections up to 2042 or 41-42. And with regard to the short, medium to long-term projection, well, in the short to medium term, the financial performance of the administration will still be healthy, but then in the longer term, there might be volatility, and therefore we will have to develop our economy, and at the same time we will have to balance the growth of government expenditure and revenue in order to realize what is enshrined in the Basic Law Article 107. So I'll defer to the Permanent Secretary for Financial Services and the Treasury, Ms. Elizabeth Chair, who will brief you on the main points of the report. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, we have 50-plus pages. I'll be very brief. I hope that I'm sure members have already read the paper. As we just said, we are making long-term projections, and we look at 3 areas: economic growth, government revenue, and government expenditure. We have taken overseas experience as our reference, and in recent years, in many places, they have also experienced very stringent financial situations. That's why they've got some experience. But then we are mainly looking at fiscal measures, and the starting point is to look at the present policies, and then we make projections on that basis. And if certain policies have to be adjusted in the future, that's not part of our work. Before we conduct this health check, we have to look at how we are doing right now. And these 3 slides show our present health position. That is, we are still very healthy. So since 1997-98, since 2004-05, we have been able to achieve a surplus year on year, but then we have also got 5 years of deficit, and the red line is the overall government expenditure. And if you look at this, well, during the first 10 years or so, basically we have been able to control our expenditure within about $200 billion, and then we grew a bit rapidly. And then in terms of revenue, there was some volatility, and in recent years our revenue has been higher than our expenditure. But then what should be noted is that most of that would be from land sale proceeds. When we look at whether or not we have acted in accordance with Article 107 of the Basic Law in achieving a fiscal balance, and whether or not we've been able to grow commensurate with the GDP growth in terms of our expenditure, we have to look at this. All right, if you look at the cumulative growth, first of all, we have to look at the red line, and that is the nominal GDP growth. That is the cumulative GDP growth. And then another line is the brown line. Basically, is government revenue. You can see that there has been some volatility, but then basically the overriding trend is following very closely with our overall GDP growth. But then if you look at government's expenditure, you see that cumulatively, government expenditure has grown somewhat more rapidly than government's revenue, and GDP growth has been growing a lot faster. And what's most important is from this chart, you can see that our expenditure and our revenue accounting for our GDP percentage, well, since the handover, on average, our expenditure is accounting for about 17.4% of our GDP, and in terms of revenue, is taking up about 18.6% of our GDP growth, or of our GDP. So you can see the government's revenue and expenditure, but then if you look at public expenditure and revenue, you have to take into account the Housing Authority and also the 5 operating funds. Basically, they would account for some 1.9% of the GDP. With an aging population, that would also expedite the pressure on our financial position. We have several examples in the report. We have also mentioned that. For example, if you look at the green line, well, for people over the age of 65, at present, there are 1.1 million, and it will grow to 2.65 million. That is by 2041-42. And in terms of the aging population, with an increase in the elderly population, our expenditure in different areas, for example, public transport for the $2 fare system and also public health system and so on, what you can see that they'll multiply. And from this chart, you can see that we have already excluded inflation. So you can see the impact of an aging population on our expenditure. And from this report, you can also see that in terms of hospitalization or healthcare services, well, for elderly and non-elderly, the cost and also the duration of stay would also be different. And of course, for the elderly, they would also stay a bit longer and the cost would also be higher. And therefore, you can see that with an aging population, we can see that the cost would also multiply. For the long-term projection, as I just said, we have to look at our economic performance, and according to our projection, what is it going to be like? Well, Hong Kong is no longer in the 60s or 70s when we had rapid growth. On average, we had about 8.9% growth year on year during the 70s, and then in the 80s it's 7.4%, and now we have stabilized, and basically we have been growing at about 3% or 4% every year. And therefore, when we do the projection, well, for the yellow part, well, we are talking about the short term, 3.5%, and then 3.3%, followed by about 2.5% in the longer term. And therefore, on average, during the projection period, we are talking about the real growth of about 2.8% year on year. Why would it fall? As you can see, if you look at the labor force, starting from 2018, the labor force is expected to decline. That is the main reason. Next, this chart also takes us through this. Other than looking at how many people will be working, we also have to look at productivity. And if we project into the future, for the blue column is the labor force, and it's going to drop, and therefore we cannot rely on that to boost economic growth. But then according to our projection, if we look at the per capita productivity, we expect that in the future we will still be able to grow at a rate that is similar to what we have experienced in the past 3 decades. And with regard to the economic growth of 2.8%, is it optimistic or pessimistic? Well, this is the trend growth looking at the past decade from 2003 to 2012, and you can see a pattern. That is for an economy, the more it's mature, the per capita GDP, if it's higher, then the growth will be stabilized and it will also become slower. And therefore, from this chart, you can see that, well, in 2012, basically, since 2003 to 2012, during the 10-year period, on average, the trend growth in Hong Kong was 4.5%. And then if you compare that with the UK and the US, these are very mature economies. And if you look at their growth rate, it's already about 2 or 3%. Therefore, 2.8% real growth is not pessimistic at all. And from this chart, you can also see that Singapore has grown out of the box somewhat. So the real growth was 5.9%. And of course, there were different factors and considerations. And when we made the projections, other than looking at the base case, we also look at different scenarios and different sensitivity tests. There were higher case and lower case, and also we also looked at a shock case. So other than economic projections, we also look at consumer price index and also inflation, and also GDP deflators, and also in the construction sector, the wages and their movements and so on. So we also look at those scenarios. So that's the pace of economic growth.
Now we come to revenue. We say that we are a small open economy, and we are very vulnerable to external environment. When we had the Asia financial turmoil and also the IT bubble burst or the global financial crisis, there was a downtrend in our economy. Regarding the blue line, which is the total government revenue, it also fluctuates a lot following the economic situation. We have adopted an not econometric model in carrying out this projection, looking at how the economy would affect our revenue from land premium, salaries tax, profits tax, stamp duty, and so on and so forth. So it is very much a 1-to-1 ratio. Well, in 2015, government revenue is about 19.8% of our GDP. Assuming that there is no change in surface level, in we will continue to enjoy a revenue of 19.8% of our GDP. Not, to put it simply, our revenue projection is about a growth of 4.5% per annum. Whereas the real GDP growth is 2.8% and nominal GDP growth 4.4%. Now we come to expenditure. Just to give you a concept, we're talking about $4,000 to $420 billion in 2014-15, accounting for 73% of our total expenditure. That is about $300 billion. And 60% is spent on education, social welfare, and health. And that's why we have singled out these three items in our task force. So we have adopted 4 scenarios. First, no service enhancement in education, social welfare, and health during the projection period. Service levels will be frozen. Expenditure will only be adjusted according to inflation and a growth in population and prices. So assuming a 1% service enhancement, another case is a 2% service enhancement, or following the historical trend, that is about 3%. So there are 4 scenarios. Now we have adopted 4 different scenarios for these 3 areas. And for other expenditure items, we assume a certain percentage of our GDP growth. Capital works. It can go up, go down with big fluctuations. So we have adopted a long-term view. From 1982 to 2014, the capital works expenditure covers expenditure from lotteries fund. It is about 3.4% of our real GDP growth. So looking forward, we will assume a 3.4% real growth in capital works. And in capital works, there is also inflation. Taking into account inflation, the percentage will grow from 3.0% now to 7%. Pensions, we have taken this into account using an actuarial model. And other government expenditure, we base our assumption on the nominal growth rate. So total government expenditure is about 9% of our GDP in 2014-15. In the 3 areas, no service enhancement scenario, at the end, it will be about 23.9% of our GDP. That's the no service enhancement scenario. Well, if there is more service enhancement, of course, the percentage of our GDP will increase. And using our historical trend, that will be 41.5% of our GDP. Looking at it year on year, using no service enhancement scenario, that's a 5.3% projected growth per annum, the highest level, and that is service enhancement at historical trend, 7.5%. So the range is from 3.3% to 7.5%, 5.3. Now, real GDP growth, we believe it will be 2.8% per annum. Nominal GDP growth, 4.4% per year. Government revenue, 4.5%. Government expenditure, 5.3% to 7.5%. The last 2 columns are, we've done a comparison of the trend since the handover and also the trend in recent years. Now, the real GDP growth might be a little bit lower, but for government revenue and expenditure, our projection hasn't deviated too much from the trend growth. One important principle of the task force is in making projection of expenditure, we don't want to exaggerate. So we have not taken into account commitment by the HA. Using our old commitment, 20,000 PRH flats per year and 5,000 HOS flats per year. Using announced unit costs, the HA in 2019 and 2020 forwards, there will be a deficit in the HA, and the cash flow shortfall would depend on the extent of rent increase. It could range from $490 billion to $130 billion. Now, assuming that 8,000 HOS flats have to be built per year, the figures will be different, and the government has to be careful. All right. Revenue and expenditure taken together will give us 3 different stages in our fiscal outlook. In the first stage, we still have a surplus. We don't have to worry about that. But sooner or later, if it is our policy to spend money as projected, then the first cross point will be where we have a sustained deficit. And then in the third stage, we will start to eat into our reserve. And then assuming that we have exhausted our reserve, then we have to borrow. So you see that using the 3 different scenarios, they get closer and closer together. For the no service enhancement situation, the first cross will happen after 15 years. Now, this is the 1% service enhancement level, and the first cross will happen in 10 years' time. At 2%, 8 years. The last, at historical trend, it will happen in 7 years' time. So all in all, you see we have got 16 assumed scenarios depending on the performance of economy and our expenditure. In all scenarios, a structural deficit will happen in 10 years' time. The second part of our work is to take reference from other jurisdictions. Details can be found in the report, and I'll skip them. The important point is, what recommendations do we have? Now, we have to adopt a multi-pronged approach. We can't say that by controlling expenditure, we don't have to consider revenue, or by stimulating our economy, we don't have to control expenditure or expand our revenue. Of course, we have to promote economic growth to be coupled by other policies. We can show you various scenarios. But to ensure financial sustainability, revenue, expenditure, and in dealing with our accounts and physical reserves and proper asset management, well, all these have to be taken into account. So assuming that we do nothing, we just want to promote our economy, then under different expenditure scenarios, what will be the actual economic growth needed? Now, at no service and enforcement, the economic growth has to be 3.1% against our projection of 2.8%. At 1%, service enhancement 3.6 per annum against our projected 2.8% per annum. So this is very hard to achieve. We talk about controlling expenditure and various measures. I think they are well known to members, and through last week's special FCs, a lot of questions have been asked. The important point is Article 107 asks us to consider three areas. We have to live within our means. We have to achieve a fiscal balance, and we have to keep our budget commensurate with the growth rate of our GDP. So all three areas have to be taken care of, and that's our summary. Thank you. 10 members have indicated their wish to speak. Let me tell you the order. Jeffrey Lam, Wong Kwok Heng, Michael Tan, Cham Kam Lam, Ronnie Tong, Christopher Zhong, Leung Kai Chang, Sin Chung Kai, myself, and Leung Sing. 4 minutes each. Mr. Jeffrey Lam. Thank you. The projection on our structural fiscal deficit assumes that the growth in expenditure would be lower, or growth in revenue would be lower than growth in expenditure for the long term. The business sector would like to see measures that can facilitate businesses and to promote our economic growth so as to attract more investment and create more jobs. Has the administration considered what measures do we have to stimulate our economy? How can we promote our economic growth? Because when this is done, we have more revenue and the problem can be avoided. And we keep saying that the government is a miser. It just sits on its reserves. We have over $700 billion, and we've also got a huge surplus in our reserves. So has the administration fully utilized this money? Has it considered that the money can be used to increase our expenditure? And public expenditure can exceed our economic growth by about 20%. And what about the exchange fund? Can it all be used? How much can be spent to support our dollar? Thank you. Which one? Perhaps I invite members of the working group to answer. Perhaps we may have to exceed the time slightly. Yes, please try best. We're very interested in this. Professor Leung, please note the time. Professor Liu. First, by promoting economic growth, can we address the problems? Yes, I believe a part of the problems can be resolved. In fact, the working group has not considered the recommendations very detailedly. This has to be done at the second stage, but we all agree that a multi-pronged approach must be adopted. And one of the proposals under that is to promote economic growth. Still, it is still a long way from seeing the problem solved, because in the coming 27 years or so, the real GDP growth per annum has to be 5.4% before we can avoid the problems just mentioned. A 5.4% real growth in GDP has gone beyond our current economic development stage. Singapore has been able to do better than 5.4%, but they can do what we can't. They mainly, half of its revenue has been saved for further investment. In Hong Kong, we can't do that. Our savings rate is more than 50% lower than that of Singapore, so this can't be done. As regards our exchange fund, of course, our fiscal reserves can be used, and we'll also have the fund balance. I don't believe the government is willing to spend that.
But then even if the two are added together, they are not that much, because if you look at our fiscal reserve, well, it's about 35% of the GDP. So out of the $700 billion, we have $600 billion under the equity fund. But then that's a far cry from resolving our future problems. But then according to our report, we have to make the best use of the return. And we do have a return right now. Well, you will have to wait till the next round. But then it's okay. So I'll leave it to the second round, but then in your exchange with the Bureau Director as to how much time will be spent on the reply and so on, you've taken up about 20 seconds from my time. So can you give me back the 20 seconds or so? Yes, please, Bureau Director. Well, the honorable member was asking about the exchange fund. We have been talking about $3,000 billion. Well, out of the $3,000 billion, about 1,000 is our borrowing in support of the monetary backing portfolio. So when you look at the exchange fund, the amount of money that can be used, that's the fiscal surplus. And as Professor Lui just said, that's the surplus that he referred to. So altogether, we have about $1,000 billion. Wong Kwok Hing. Madam Chair, in the executive summary, paragraph 54, the working group said that we will have to set up this saving scheme, and we will have to freeze the lands fund, and that will have to be turned into a conceptual fund in the future. It will be called the future fund. So I'd like to ask a bit more about this with regard to the freezing of the land fund and also the setting of the future fund. What's the concept about? So what kind of future are we talking about? Well, Professor Nelson Chow, in the middle of the year, will be submitting a report on retirement protection. So under the future fund, is it possible for us to use part of it so that that can be used for future retirement protection? That could also be a startup fund or a seed fund for the future retirement protection fund. So can you answer the question? Can I ask Mr. Wong, a member of the working group, to answer the question? So Mr. Marcellus Wong. Thank you. With regard to the concept of the future fund, just now Ms. Elizabeth Chair already referred to that. We have made reference from some overseas experience as to the measures that can be used to counter an aging population and the pressure that might be brought about on the administration. So we have to look at the implication of an aging population. And as it's been said just now, if you look at the present economic situation or our fiscal position, we are still very healthy. So the problems will only emerge in 7 to 10 years' time. And taking reference from overseas experience, they have also set up something like a future fund so that for present resources, they have saved that for rainy days, so that in the future, when we have to meet certain expenditure, then we can make use of the future fund to meet those commitments. The concept of a future fund is still very initial. As to its use, the working group did discuss whether or not it should be used for designated purposes. For example, just now the honorable member referred to meeting future retirement commitments or future healthcare uses, social welfare, or infrastructure expenditure. Well, we are still looking into it as an initial concept, and therefore we think that should be left to the future. But then we are still discussing on whether or not this concept should be put into place and how it's going to operate. For example, where is the source of this seed fund? We have this land fund right now, and there is no designated purpose as to how the land fund could be used. We think that we can first make use of the land fund, and then in the future there might be some surpluses, and if there are further surpluses, then we can also put that into the fund, and the investment can also be independent from the exchange fund, and also the fiscal reserves investment on the exchange fund, and we can also have more aggressive investment portfolios yielding higher returns, and according to overseas experience, the outcome has been quite satisfactory in terms of the return on such funds. Mr. Wong, can you answer my question direct? That is adopting according to what you said just now. So can you be more affirmative in this? That is, the future fund can also set aside part of it into the seed money or startup fund for future retirement protection. Is that possible, Mr. Wong? As I just said, the working group has not come to any conclusion on how the fund should be used in the future. And we think that we should leave it to the future. Mr. Michael Tian, can I get the earlier slide, the 3.1, 5.4, and so on? Which slide? Which slide? The no service enhancement scenario growing at 3.1%. Well, with limited time, Madam Chair, I'd like to say that the administration said that the earliest would be 7 years and the latest would be 15 years. There will be a structural deficit. In order to avoid that, I believe that the most important thing is not just to make savings. The most important thing is to open up more sources of revenue, Professor. So that is the highlight. That is, we have to have more sources of revenue. Well, using the no service enhancement scenario, the actual growth will have to increase from the present 2.8 to 3.1%. So this 0.4% additional growth will not be easy. But then if we look at the political landscape and pace of democratic development, people will not allow you to stay at the no enhancement level. And if you're not able to achieve the 0.4% additional growth, then everybody will be surrounding and besieging the CGO, and therefore the 3.1% is just a pipe dream. You cannot afford to do that. So how are we able to increase the pace of economic growth? Looking at Singapore, we are both developing as external-oriented mature economies, and if you look at the past growth, the average is 2.7%. Bureau Director, you haven't given me the figure. I've tried to check that on myself. So in Singapore, it's 4.8%, and in our case, it's 2.7%. So it's about a 2% discrepancy. So just if you've been able to get 1 additional percent, then 2.8 plus 1 will be 3.8%, close to 4% already. And if you look at the analysis by some academics and scholars, there are 2 factors. Number 1, our population policy. In Singapore, in terms of importing foreign labor, they've been able to do so, and they've been able to increase their productivity. And by 2012, they had 880,000 low-skilled workers, accounting for some 28% of the labor force. And then under the supplementary importation scheme in Hong Kong, we only have about 2,400, so it's about 0.1% of our total labor force, and we have full employment right now. Under the circumstances, we are already losing out. And secondly, it's about a reclamation to create land. And the Secretary for Development told us that in Singapore, they're actually reclaiming land, accounting for some 20% of the total land in the urban area. And then in Hong Kong, over the years, we're only talking about 7%. I've said many times that in order to maintain steady land supply, land is very important, and in new territories, and if you try to develop land in the new territories, we have been working on that for 20 years, and we are trying to create units for some 60,000 people. So how can that be cost effective? And therefore we will have to reclaim land. But then what is most serious in Hong Kong is that we are short of land. It's not about Hong Kong property for Hong Kong people. So the most important thing is we have to look at our population policy, and also we have to reclaim land for development. And if you admit that those are the 2 problems, then have you reviewed your policy? Do you have a timetable as to when we can implement this policy of reclaiming land for development? Well, I'll be brief in my reply on people and land. Well, the administration recognized that in our economic development, these are the 2 major constraints. And you talk about land creation. Well, most people would feel that this is a problem. And in Singapore, yes, if you look at the figures in Singapore, I have to provide these figures to facilitate our discussion so that we can have the same basis for discussion. Yes, you are right in the sense that Singapore's economic growth has been faster than that in Hong Kong. But then in terms of importation of labor, that has increased very substantially. For foreign labor, it has accounted for 1/3 of the total labor force, and they're talking about some 82,000 per year. And then as a result of productivity, we are talking about a growth of 4.4%. It's 5 times that in Hong Kong, and therefore, as you heard, the working group's conclusion is that without growth in population, our economic growth will slow down. And if you look at the Singaporean experience, in the past they have been able to grow very quickly. That's because of that. And in terms of land, that's the same. So in terms of land development, they are 10 times that in Hong Kong. So as Professor Lui just said, we may not be able to adopt what is done in Singapore. But then if you look at the land policy and population policy, yes, indeed, that's something that we have to bear in mind. But then the Bureau Director has not answered my question. He agrees with my analysis. But then I was asking how we can tie in our population policy with that. Will they consider appropriately importing labor? Next, Chen Kam Lam. Thank you, Madam Chair. Just now, we looked at the PowerPoint presentation. My impression is that I was doubting that over the years, our Financial Secretary might not have acted in accordance with Article 107 of the Basic Law. That is, we have to live within our means. If he had done so, then why is it that in terms of our expenditure, the growth has been somewhat faster than the growth in our revenue? So that is something that we need to reflect on. Well, with regard to the recommendation made by the working group, I think they are very good. So that has enlightened us so that in the future, in terms of our expenditure and economic development, we have to work a bit harder. Just now, we've been told that we have to make the pie larger. But then in the report, it has not talked about how we can develop our economy in order to make the pie bigger. So my impression is that in the next 20 years or so, what is likely to happen is that the culprit of all evils is that our infrastructure or capital expenditure will go up, and then with an aging population, all expenditure will go up, and then our labor force will come down. And then in terms of economic growth, according to the present policies, if we just stick to the present policies, then our economy will become weaker. And in terms of our competitiveness, we will become less competitive. So my question is, has the working group considered this? That is, in the foreseeable future, what you're most worried about? Well, because of the reforms in our political or democratization, will that lead to the emergence of populism? And as a result, welfare spending, healthcare spending, education spending, and so on will substantially increase. And because of our political development, as we have not aligned that with our economy, as a result of that, our revenue will not be able to go up substantially. So what are your concerns? So are you most concerned about the emergence of populism? Who is going to answer the question? Elizabeth? Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to clarify this because the working group is politically neutral. We will not make any judgment as to whether or not we should spend more on welfare or healthcare or health. So we are just making projections. We are just doing calculations. We ask different policy bureaus what are their projections on future spending in accordance with population projection and so on. So as to where the money should be spent is not what the working group is supposed to do. So we just look at the existing policies and we just make an assessment on that basis. If that is the case, then there might be another view. All right, if part of our reserve of some $220 billion, if that's used to set up the future fund, but then we also may have to do some calculations. That is for our basic reserve that should be sufficient to meet government spending for, say, 12 months or 18 months or whatever. So if you look at that amount, we are talking about the $700 billion plus. So what can really be used will be limited. We may be just talking about $100 billion or so, because we have some $200 billion that cannot be used, and then about $400 billion that also cannot be used. So will there be a scenario whereby even though we have over $700 billion reserved, but then what can really be used will be very limited? Is that the case?
A simple reply, please. P.S. It's true that there's analysis of our reserves in the report. I think about $394 billion can be spent from our general accounts, and for the rest they are in dedicated funds. And Capital Works Reserve Fund, they're about $78.6 billion, enough for spending for a year only. Now we have got a Category A items, and the unspent balance is about $340 billion. That's already committed. So do we really have a lot to spend in our reserves? We have to take into account that in the coming few years we could continue to spend money on capital works. Mr. Anitong. Yeah, it's good to have such a working group. It should have been set up a long time ago, and it is already a bit late. The conclusion of the working group is based on a number of assumptions. So I'm very interested in those assumptions. First, there is no mention of demographic policy or projections in the report. This is one of the biggest factor affecting your conclusions, because since the handover, population growth has been rather steady. In fact, we have a downward trend now. Government expenditure has been increasing. It's because in the past we had done too little, and we are trying to catch up. Assuming that population growth has plateaued, then increase in government expenditure will not increase forever. Take medical health as an example. It's true that with an aging population, we have more spending on medical and health, but what about education and also housing and even social welfare? In these areas, I don't think the expenditure will continue to grow. So can the experts tell us about these assumptions? And then in the report, is my guess correct? I think you have disregarded inflation in your calculation. You assume that have you taken into account inflation in your annual expenditure? Because this is also another important factor impacting on your findings. And secondly, can inflation be offset with our savings? And I think we need answers for this. And in the past few years, we have many one-off measures, the goodies. They account for over 100 billion. They have accounted for over $600 billion. Would it regard it as recurrent expenditure or not? Assuming that we won't hand out any goodies in the future, will there be a reduction in government expenditure or increase? You have to tell us in your formula. Are you assuming that it will continue to hand out hundreds of billions of dollars in goodies every year? Okay, 3 questions. All right, assumptions. Professor Loy, I may not be able to answer all the questions. Other members of the working group may be more appropriate. Regarding population projection, yes, we have included that. Education, as we all know, the number of students may drop in the future, and we arrived at this total. We have taken into account changes in our population. This is just a summary of our calculation. So starting point of the report is closely related to our demographic changes. If there were no aging population, then Professor, do you agree that as our population grows old, will we see an increase in education spending? That's possible, because the unit cost has risen very rapidly. And education accounts for about 3% of our GDP, whereas the median figure in the world is 5%, so we are very far below the world median. Will this increase under pressure from the community? We don't know. We can just say that in terms of quality, there are growing demand for the education of quality of education, and this is a world trend, not just for Hong Kong. And what about inflation and other assumptions? PS? Yes, for education. Mr. Ronnie Tong can consider this. Using our no service enhancement scenario, education will grow from 3% to 2.8% of our GDP. So if we freeze our service level, in fact, it will drop. When we did the projection, we have deliberately not to exaggerate our expenditure. Take education as example. The relevant bureau gave us the spending and also the number of students and the changes in number in primary, kindergarten and secondary and post-secondary education. For instance, the expenditure on staff costs have also been taken out and it's been adjusted according to inflation. So we've tried to be very meticulous. But 2.8 is a far cry from 7.7% because there are 4 different scenarios. Now, no service enhancement, we'll see the bottom line, 1%, 2%, and historical trend. So we've worked out all the figures for you to do the analysis. And we have not exaggerated those one-off relief measures. They have all been taken out in our consumption, in our assumptions. Deputy Chairman, thank you. Now, if expenditure grow at historical trends, then in 7 years' time we will have a structural deficit, and then we should set up a future fund to save for a rainy day. However, the income will be from our land sales proceeds, $220 billion, and 1/3 of our government revenue would be put into this future fund. This is also part of the government's reserves. Now, if we don't set a future fund, still it will be in our accounts. So why do we have to set up a future fund? What about the return? Do you want the return to be higher than the return from our exchange fund? And how are you going to spend this large amount of money? Who has the say? Will it be like the MPF? And what will be the investment items? Are there risks involved? Mrs. Wong, please. Thank you. As regards the future fund, we have to make clear that it is not the sole measure to tackle our problem. We have put forward things for members to consider. Why do we want to set up the future fund now? Because this has been done in other countries as well. And why do we do it? Because we have to face an unprecedented scenario in Hong Kong, and that is the pressure brought about by our aging population. So when our physical health is sound, we have to plan for the future and save up for a rainy day. And we intend not to keep the future fund together with other reserves. It is for the long term. Of course, there must be some public consultation. If the future fund can be done, then in the long term, well, it can be managed by somebody else. And of course, we also want the return to be better than our other funds. Take Australia as an example. They have a similar fund invested in more aggressive items. Regarding the operation and use of the future fund, we will take care of that in our second stage. Thank you. Mr. Kenneth Leung. Thank you. First, I'd like to talk about the development model of Singapore. I don't think it's necessary for us to compare us with Singapore because they have land reclamation and importation of labor. Many economists have criticized this model. Can this model be sustainable in the coming 5 to 10 years? It is doubtful. And Singapore has paid political and social costs as a result. Singapore is using administrative measures to suppress wages, which should be determined by market forces. And this is something very bad for the local labor. So we don't need to always compare with Singapore in everything. This projected 2.8% real GDP rate, is it on the conservative side? Can information be given to us to show how mature economies have performed in the past decade? Is it true that they had 2.8% real GDP growth as well? Or is it this rather conservative in order to achieve what you want to achieve? And page 15 of the slide. Starting from 2018, our labor force would drop, causing our economic growth to slow down. Yes, our labor force may shrink, but we can offset it by growth in capital deepening and productivity. Now, if we work more on these two areas, then our overall economic growth might be brought to a high level. Well, by productivity, I'm talking about the productivity per capita. And if you use other means such as automation, we'll be able to change our economic mode, and then we'll be able to maintain our original economic growth. Can we do that, Professor? Singapore has implemented many correct policies, but some of them cannot be done in Hong Kong. I'm sure members would agree with me. The so-called projected growth rate of 2.8%, it is not assumption, it is a projection. And I would say that it is on the, I think we are over-optimistic rather than too pessimistic. This is because our growth in productivity for a long time is only 1.8% in Hong Kong. So in the following 10 years or so, it's been increased to 2.2%, which is far above that of the growth in productivity in Singapore. Now, this is not about labor force efficiency. This is, well, all of a sudden you increase it by 5%. Well, this is growth in efficiency. Perhaps in Singapore they have done a lot. In many countries they can use automation, but this is not going to enhance efficiency, because if the method is not in tune with the stage of development, it can be a waste of resources. I cannot agree entirely that in the coming 2 years we can have a 2.2% growth in productivity, because in Singapore it's just about 1%. Singapore can grow so rapidly because of reclamation as well as importation of labor. And other factor is heavy investment in education. Accounting for almost 50% of its GDP in Hong Kong is just 23-24%. So we lack far behind Singapore. If we disregard this factor, I don't think Singapore could have grown as quickly as it has.
And also the per capita spending in Singapore is a lot lower than that in Hong Kong. Yes, the GDP growth might have been faster, but then their per capita GDP spending is a lot less than that in Hong Kong because a lot of GDP has been used for investment. Next, Chen Kin Po. Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, the administration is doing this long-term planning. I think this is good for us. And many factors will affect our revenue. In the first slide, you talk about our present fiscal or financial performance, as the Permanent Secretary said. Well, one of the important sources of revenue for us is from land sales. So I'd like to ask the administration with regard to your projection into the future. How much will we get from land sales? And if we are able to create land by reclamation, then will that generate more revenue? And if we are bolder, if we are able to use 1% of the country parks for construction of houses, and then we can sell that, then what kind of revenue will we generate? And also we discuss a lot about Singapore. Yes, there are unique factors in Singapore resulting in their growth. Well, some can be adopted in Hong Kong, others not. But then to us, the most important factor is that we can see that in the world, there are examples with appropriate strategies. In fact, your performance can be somewhat different. So we are not suggesting that we should learn everything from Singapore. To us, the most meaningful thing in Singapore is that you cannot say that you cannot go beyond the curve that has been projected. And therefore, we can also take advantage of our advantages so that we might be able to create a more conducive environment than Singapore. For example, our tax is a lot lower than that in the mainland. And if you can look at the growth pattern in the mainland, is still kept at a very high level. And if we are able to align our growth with the mainland, then our growth will be a lot higher than that in Singapore. So please do not demean ourselves. We have to come up with ways to take advantage of our advantages. We don't have to compare ourselves with Singapore. So long as we are able to align with the growth in the mainland, then we'll be able to grow a lot faster. And also, we're going to, Singapore will have to spend a lot more than us. Well, we have to spend more in the future. That's something that we cannot change. So we have to think about how we can generate more income. For example, we will have to reduce profit tax in order to achieve a growth in revenue. So can that be considered? I'd like to ask this. Well, according to Professor Francis Lui's analysis, well, the working group also looked at the 2.8% growth and how did it come about. Well, he also pointed out that to achieve that is already very challenging. We cannot say that we can assume that we'll be able to achieve that very easily, because if you look at this projection, actually, if Hong Kong will have to maintain what's been done in the past 10, 20 years so that we can have the same momentum of growth before we can achieve that. And if you look at the past 10, 20 years, we have benefited from the emergence of China. And also, because of our population growth and so on, we have been able to create a bigger pie. And if we were to achieve this objective, and according to the projection by the working group, to achieve that, then both the administration, the business sector, and all quarters in the community will have to work very hard. We have to continue to innovate, and also we have to resolve the constraints in terms of population and land before we can achieve that figure. So actually, when the working group came up with this projection, as far as the administration is concerned, this is very much an alert. Number one, we have to create a bigger pie, and we will have to work harder in order to make things better. And there is room for us to discuss how that can be achieved. And Professor Lui also talked about things that we have to look into. Professor Lui said that not all investments would be efficient. And if you look at another place's policy, it doesn't mean that we have to copy from them. We have to look at Hong Kong's economic growth and our pattern of growth in order to see how we can create a bigger pie that would be more reliable. But you have not touched on land sales. No, I haven't got the figures. Permanent Secretary? Yes, if you look at this chart, actually, during the first 10 years of reunification, if you look at land sales proceeds, actually it will account for some 2.01% of our GDP. It's about $27.2 billion in the first 10 years. But then in the subsequent years, well, from land sales, we are actually talking about 3 to 4% of our GDP. So it's been a lot more substantial. So out of the $600 billion, out of these, well, we manage to get about $60 billion every year. And then using the econometric model, well, by 2041, it will account for some 3.2% of our GDP. Next, Sin Chung Kai. Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I'd like to welcome the working group on long-term fiscal planning here. And the working group has also comprised many experts, including Professor Lui and another professor. Both are very respected scholars to me. I think the working group has come up with this report about 4 or 5 years late. Well, under the leadership of the Financial Secretary, Mr. John Zhang, during the past 7 years, we have dished out some $200 billion as sweeties, and he talked about boosting the economy or reviving the economy and so on. But then, well, if we have to save money for an aging population during the past 7 years, we should have a lot of room for doing that. But then we gave up a lot of money, and the basic law also talk about living within our means, and we should avoid having a structural deficit. Well, as far as the grassroots are concerned, they are very concerned that with the report from the working group, the administration is going to use it as a shield to constrain the services that are most needed by the community, so that no improvement would be made, because by living within our means, we cannot increase tax, we cannot increase revenue, and as a result, in order to resolve the structural deficit that we are going to face, and we may have to suppress our future demand. Well, in Hong Kong, there are many services that have to be improved, and yet the administration has not quantified these future demands. Madam Chair, I'd like to emphasize this point. When we look at the future work of the working group, they should look at our future needs. Well, by that, I mean, well, as one of your members said, the biggest challenge is an aging population. And with an aging population, one of the biggest challenges would be healthcare demand. How are we able to ensure that in terms of our hospital beds and also the care and attention homes places will be able to meet this basic demand, so that people will not wait till after they are passed away before they can get a place. So Hong Kong has not looked at this future demand, and if the highlight of the working group can be placed on future demand, and of course we will need the cooperation from the other policy bureaus. The other day I put it to Dr. Koh Wing Man, and he was wishy-washy about changing this. Should it be 1%, 2%, or 3% in terms of service enhancement? How are we able to meet our future demand? So I have several comments to make. Number one, I believe that the working group should be regularized. All right, for the MRF, you're doing that year in, year out. So for the working group, even if you are not going to do that every year, then at least you should have reviewed the situation once every 5 years. So do you have plans to regularize the work of the working group? I'm not blindly going for GDP growth. I'm not an economist. But then in order to build a bridge, we will have a GDP, and demolishing a bridge would also have GDP implications. But then, in the end, without the bridge, actually we are starting from scratch, and therefore the most important thing is to improve people's livelihood. So, in other words, we have to meet future demands. But then, apparently, the working group has not quantified future demands, and therefore, you have not worked towards meeting future demands, and therefore, you will have to show us. That is how you're able to quantify future demands. And if you are able to do that, then that would benefit us more. Who is going to answer this question? So would that be a continuous work? Well, of course. I'd like to thank you for your comment. We will consider how we can continue with that work. And in simple terms, I'd just like to say that the working group's task is to quantify the future demand on the basis of present policies. And what Mr. Sin just said, a lot should be considered as to how future policy bureaus can make projections on that basis. including enhancement of services, and to what extent should we enhance our services. And a lot would also help us in looking at our future financial position or fiscal position. Yes, I can see that there are a lot of challenges. And therefore, while we have to observe or comply with the basic law in living within our means, there are also priorities that we will have to set in dealing with the demands in a community. We will also have to streamline our procedures in order to ensure that our services are provided in the most cost-effective manner. Next, Ng Leung Sing. Thank you, Madam Chair. With regard to preparing for rainy days by the setting up of this future fund, I think I agree with this direction, because after all, we are short of resources, and we are all very concerned that with the change in our population profile, we are going to have more people who are going to consume more, and yet there are fewer people making money. And if we do not plan for the future, then we will not be doing justice to our future generations. That's why I am in favor of this direction. But then, on the proposal to freeze the land fund, well, with regard to the word freezing, I would have to look at it from the political perspective. All right, the land fund was set up in the 80s, and I have to declare interest. I was also one of the trustees of the land fund. But then that was set up for the purpose of planning for the future. That's planned by our CPG for the purpose of the SARG, so that there would be this reserve set up for the SARG, and I was fortunate enough in offering some services to the group. But then if we were to freeze it, then is an issue of historical legacy. We should leave it to the SARG in deciding whether or not it should be frozen. But then if it's frozen, then you will also have to look at how it's been doing during the past 16, 17 years. So what has happened? Well, at the time when we handed that over to the SARG, we had about $200 billion. And now we have about $219.7 billion. So it increased by about $20 billion. And the surplus was accumulated in 16 years. So you see that in terms of the growth, well, it went up by some 10% in 16 years. So you can see that the return, well, if you look at the assumptions, when I look at the slide, well, on the assumptions, well, in the future, the investment return, if it has to be at 5%, I think the difficulty will have to be taken into account. And of course, what with interest rate, well, during the past few years, well, it remained at a very low level, and therefore we can only expect it to go up in the future. But then, in terms of our budget every year, what's the assumed or the projected surplus? Is it standing at $20 billion or what? So let's say if we have $60 billion and then $20 billion out of that will be set aside for the purpose. Is that the case? Or else, let's say if we have $51 billion or $510 billion, it's not easy to achieve. And if that is the case, then what's the investment strategy going to be like with the new reserve fund being set up? Just now we heard that you would be more aggressive. So what kind of investment strategy is that going to be like? So can you tell us more about that? Who is going to respond? Well, I'll be brief in my clarification. Well, in the past, we did use the land fund during our deficit years. We set aside some $110 billion out of the land fund in our reserve. The reason why it did not go up very quickly because it was used at the time when we had a deficit. So I'd like to give some time to Mark Sanders, who will tell us more about the investment strategy of the future fund. Yes.
So I apologise if I don't get all of the details of the question through the translation, but I think we're all in broad agreement that the need for a future fund in terms of being a discipline that we need to instill. After all, saving is just another fiscal tool. Saving for the future. So, you know, we have not worked out the details of the future fund. All we're simply saying is, amongst the multi-pronged approach, there needs to be a future fund. A consideration could be that it could be invested more wisely, more aggressively, and also even to invest in things that would help enhance the competitiveness of Hong Kong. So invest in some technology companies where we can then import not necessarily people but expertise. So all of those things are really, we have not isolated, we have not defined those as at this current time. It's really to raise as our hypothesis. I think it's as well important to point out that even on those assumptions, okay, that's quite a lot of money, but it's not going to cure the issue. It's not going to address the problem, this future fund on its own. It is just something that if things get bad, will buy us some time while we address the main issues. So I think that there are a number of concepts from that, and I apologize I've not answered the detail of your question, but the fact is we haven't really gone into the detail of the mechanics of how the whole thing will operate.
好啊，下一位係胡志偉議員。
Mr. Wu Chi-wei. Thank you, Madam Chair. I was not here at the earlier discussion, but I note that in the working group, the emphasis is to remind the government to be more careful in controlling expenditure. The focus should be on the recurrent expenditure arising from the aging population. However, in its budget, the FS stressed that the future fund should be invested in infrastructure in the future. So I think there is a very obvious difference in terms of the fiscal management philosophy, because according to the paper, the working group reminds the government that when dealing with capital investment, there should be 2 points to note. First, it should be in commensurate with the economic growth rate. Secondly, investment in infrastructure is not always a win-win situation. So we have to be very careful in considering the actual economic outcome of such investment before we're making a commitment. So what is the fiscal management philosophy for the future fund? Yes, our aging population will cause our recurrent expenditure to rise. We understand that we have to plan for the future. I think there are only 2 ways for us to do it. First, we save up for the future needs of the aging population, and the second is to create a bigger pie. By promoting economic growth, we can have enough money to satisfy the need. Secretary. The recommendation of the working group on the future fund, well, we've just explained our rationale. And the FS already read the report, and he agrees that this is the direction forward, though the details have yet to be ironed out. As regards the use of the future fund, the FS is of the view that, yes, we have set aside money to be spent in the future. And the money can hardly cope with sustained and recurrent needs. It can only be spent on time-limited items. So the FS has considered infrastructure, but that is not just about a construction of roads and bridges. It can also cover housing and all other things that the government has to do. When the government had fiscal deficit, some investment in public works were cut, affecting socio-economic development. So perhaps some money can be saved for use in such items in the future, because such projects are time limited. But this is just a very initial thinking. It's just a suggestion, and we will discuss with the members of the working group on the future mode and operation and use of the future fund. I want to ask in the second round. Now it's my turn. I appreciate the work of the working group. At least it can help us to have another focused discussion on the long-term fiscal development of Hong Kong. I think we all agree that we must create a bigger pie, and many members have mentioned the Singaporean model, and I also agree with some of the colleagues here. Yes, Singapore has its own development pace, and in Hong Kong with our own pace, and we should not envy Singapore because we have different models, and we understand the merits and demerits of the model in Singapore, and then we should map out our way forward. So, Secretary, I think you understand the Singaporean model very well. Have you considered other mature economies? What is the economic growth situation of these economies? I think many people have mentioned the successful example of South Korea. Now, in the past, Apple dominated the market. Now, Samsung is also popular, and a Korean drama has also overtaken our local industry. I think Korean drama is catching up rapidly. So, Secretary, will you study the growth model of other mature economies to see whether there is anything for us to learn from them? Secretary. Yes. I think these examples are frequently discussed within the government and in the community. How can we borrow from the success of these economies? I hope that after the report is published now, we can tackle these issues seriously. Now, we're not talking something in this year or the next, but something for the long term. I don't want to tell you my long-term view. Any members from the working group would like to share? Mark?
May I just add one comment? Thanks. I'm very proud to Hong Kong's my home. Hong Kong is very different. So yes, we shouldn't look with envy at Singapore or indeed other nations. We have an advantage. The big advantage of Hong Kong is the alignment of the people to want to do the right thing. And the solution to this issue is not just going to be government, so it's not just going to be public. It's going to need public-private partnership and every one of us in the community to take. So we're talking about aging and need to be looked after when we're old. Well, we can do more about ourselves in terms of our own wellness. So it's not just public, it's public, private, and members of the community. As we've got this unique advantage, and everybody's going to be driven together to achieve the right outcome. And I think we need to get that message out as well, that we can't just, as JFK famously said, don't ask what your country can do for you, it's what can you do for your country. We can sort this out, and that's the great advantage Hong Kong has.
好啊，局長，其實我就想具體建議或者。
Yes, some suggestion for you, Secretary. Members of the working group are experts in their own areas, but to promote economic growth and to create a bigger pie, we need the assistance of the bureaus. All right, I just quoted two examples which are useful reference for us. Have you considered, or perhaps the FS should be the coordinator of different bureaus to see how we can build up our economy? To be fair, I think the government is aware of this, and it is very actively trying to increase land supply. And for importation of labor, this is something for the community to discuss. But for creating a bigger pie, have you considered involving other departments? Yes, the Economic Development Commission and also the Economic Development and Commerce Bureau has ongoing reviews. I think the working group has pointed out issues that have gone beyond what should be tackled urgently. This is about productivity, education. I cannot just briefly answer your question with my personal opinion. I think it is something for the whole community. Yes, please consider my suggestions. Second round, 5 members would like to speak in the second round. Since we're very concerned about this subject, let's reserve more time to this item. 3 minutes each. Mr. Ronnie Tong. Yes, I'd like to follow up on one example I referred to. It's difficult to follow up on all subjects. First, on education, I'd like to ask the experts, do you agree that assuming that our population is aging, it will conflict with an increase in a population that needs education? I think you're assuming that with an education industry, which was proposed by the last term of government, when the education population drops, then using this chart, the PS told us that at no service enhancement, we're already enhancing the quality of education. With fewer students, then the investment per capita should go up. So this 2.8% is not really no service enhancement scenario. 2.8 and 7.7%, there is a big discrepancy between the two. I'd like to know whether you're really assuming that, are you really trying very hard not to exaggerate your expenditure so as not to terrify the people of Hong Kong? Professor, this 2.8%, we have really considered the unit cost of education. We have already fully taken into account the population that require education. Right. The top line, well, when we invest more in education, can we help the economy? This is for sure. We will understand that. But we also have to bear in mind, it doesn't mean that by increasing 2 or 3% in education, you can ensure sustained development of our economy to 5.4%. If we can reach 5.4%, all problems will have gone away. To do that, from 3% of our GDP, we have to increase our spending on education to 5%. It cannot make a big impact on our economic growth unless by spending $1 on education, you get a return of $10. Can you boost our long-term economic growth to 5.4%? I don't think my question has been answered. Assuming, I'm asking whether your assumption is reasonable or not. And the same applies for housing. When there is no growth in population, housing built now will still be here 10 years after. You cannot increase your spending on education and housing indefinitely unless your population is growing indefinitely. Well, let's set aside health care. I don't think you will have to spend more and more on social welfare, housing, and education, because what is built or what is done today will still be here 10 years afterwards. So I think there is a big problem with your assumption. I've also noticed that the assumption on spending on education has received a lot of criticism. I'm not querying whether we should invest in education. No. I'm not a member of the working group, but as Professor said, assuming that the unit cost remains the same, now the education population would drop, so the overall spending on education would drop. But can you really assume that there will be no change in the unit cost? So there are different scenarios, and you can see the lines. The working group has not made a decision on what is the most reasonable scenario. It's just showing you the situation under different scenarios. I understand the members of the working group in particular don't want to make that decision. All these figures are for members' discussion and reference.
亦想跟進翻頭先雷鼎明教授嘅答案。雷教授頭先講咗就話新加坡嗰個投資率係20%幾。咁我想問一問咧，究竟呢一個投資率究竟係咪加埋 GIC 淡馬錫等等嘅法定機構投資，或係私人嘅投資咧？咁我亦都得到一個即係比較即係一個 interim 嘅 conclusion 就係話咧，其實當個資源有限嘅時候，政府嘅支出其實有兩難，就係話
resources are limited, then are they going to increase recurrent spending or are they going to increase capital expenditure? Because if you look at the member from the working group and what they just said, apparently the report is implying that if Hong Kong's economy were to have sustained growth, then in terms of capital expenditure, that's very important. And just now, Professor Lui also said that the marginal propensity to consume and to save, you also look at our economic history. Well, if an economy's marginal propensity to save is high, then that would also be conducive to the long-term economic growth of that economy. So, given that, if the administration is subject to a lot of pressure, that is, the recurrent spending will have to increase, and also per capita expenditure will also have to increase, then under the two scenarios, what can be done? I'm most concerned about this. Who is to answer this question? Professor Lui? Well, in the case of Singapore, the investment rate is not 20+%. Is that Hong Kong's investment rate is 20+% of our GDP. So when compared to 20-30 years ago, it has come down. Hong Kong is not increasing its investment in terms of its GDP. Well, in Singapore, they once exceeded 50%. In other words, they've been very aggressive and ambitious in their investment, and whether or not Singapore's approach is suitable for Hong Kong and also in general is set reasonable. My personal opinion is that well, there are other policies that are reasonable. For example, increasing spending on education and also reclaiming for creating land. That's also reasonable. But then in terms of productivity improvement, that's very slow. And given that, and if you invest that heavily economically, then economically that's not a suitable approach. But then they have their own considerations, and Hong Kong cannot just copy their experience. Thank you. Next, Wu Chi-wai. Thank you, Madam Chair. Just now, from the Secretary's reply, well, I understand that for the future fund is mainly for supporting what the administration is going to do, that is investing in our infrastructure, because they believe that by doing so, we are able to create a bigger pie. But then in the paper, it has repeatedly emphasized that we are faced with this situation of an aging population. So my question is, well, when we talk about investing in our infrastructure, then with regard to the return that we can get from the infrastructure, and then from that we can also support the needs in terms of spending by the aging population. All right, for the airport, we have the Airport Authority. That is also one of the infrastructure projects that we have invested. But then through the investment or the listing of the AA, then we will be able to have this return, and it will look at its own overall operation, and it will become an entity or enterprise that will yield return. So is that the concept? So that in terms of the return from this money, that would also be used to support the long-term resources that would be needed by a community with an aging population. So is that the idea? In other words, we're using recurrent income to support our recurrent expenditure, in simple terms. In fact, according to what I said just now, our initial thinking is that in terms of our direction, with the establishment of a future fund, the uses cannot be unlimited. It can also be used for supporting a recurrent item, because still we are talking about a limited amount of money and a limited resource. And therefore, when there is an economic downturn, then in terms of works items, we might be short of money, and therefore if we have this future fund available, then that would also help to kickstart these infrastructure projects so that there would not be any slippage. So that's the idea. Well, the working group, well, as far as its recommendation is concerned, it has not come to this conclusion. But then after looking at its report, we believe that this direction can be discussed. I think the most important thing is a defensive fund, so that when there is a downturn in the economy, do we have any defensive fund that would enable us to withstand the poor performance in our economy, so that government's work will not be slowed down as a result of that. So we're trying to resolve those problems at a time of economic downturn. Do you have anything to add, Permanent Secretary? Yes. In terms of the fund's investment, it should not be interpreted as being invested in bridges and roads and so on. Well, the working group also look at, with an aging population, we need a lot of hospitals and hospital beds. In fact, you also asked this. We have also got hold of some figures from the Hospital Authority by 2040 plus. So how many hospital beds do we need? So we have an idea as to how much it would cost. It's very costly, and that would require a lot of investment. And also in the lotteries fund, we would also have to build homes for the elderly and so on. All these are infrastructural projects in order to cope with an aging population. And also we have to boost our economy. For example, environmental protection is something that we will have to work on. And therefore, from that we can see we have a very good idea that it's going to be very costly. And therefore, it's not that we have not taken into account people's livelihood. All these have to do with people's livelihood. Next is myself asking in the second round. After hearing so long, I am not convinced that we need to set up this future fund. Apparently, it's for dedicated projects, so we're saving money for certain projects, and with a better return, then we can be sure that these designated projects will have sufficient funds to fund them. But then my question is, why do we have to have this dedicated or designated future fund? Because your reserve fund has been doing that. So why do we have to rely on this future fund? And you've also cited an example, that is Australia. So other than Australia, are there any other places that have adopted the same approach with very good results? So can you tell us more about this? Thank you. Jennifer? Mrs. Jennifer Wong. Well, on the idea of the future fund, many will ask, so it's just the difference between the left and the right pocket. Yes, we have limited money. Yes, it's between the right and the left pocket. But then after we have set aside the money, for example, by freezing the land fund can only be used on certain areas, but then there is no designation as to how it should be used for. And my understanding is that if we want to use the land fund, we will have to put it to the vote by this council. And therefore, land fund is in any case an idle fund. So our idea is, why don't we take that out? Well, for the time being, we don't have any specific use for the future fund. We are aware of the problem, and we're trying to set aside the money so that people will not try to look at when and how it can be used. So we'll set this aside. So when people look at our reserve, they will look at the $400 billion that can be used because we have several funds which have designated uses, and some $200 billion cannot be used for other purposes. And then another use of it is that in the event, after consultation and discussion, that in the future we can use this fund for a long time, so that the investment return can be somewhat better, because for the time being, for all the funds and reserve, we only have the exchange fund, and the return is very conservative. So that's why we have come up with this suggestion. So other than Australia, in fact, Norway also had a similar fund, and of course, in the case of Norway, it's not very similar to the situation in Hong Kong, because in Norway they have a lot of resources and they can make use of those resources, and they can also make money out of those resources in order to meet their future needs. That's why in the report we have not specifically highlighted that. But then closer to Hong Kong is the Australian experience, and of course their fund has designated uses. But then in our case, we have not thought about the designated use for the future fund. We believe that in the second round we can discuss that. We can also consult, and then we can work out the consensus together. All right, I have a better understanding. I think the best thing is to defreeze the land fund so that it can be put to some uses in the future. All right, I understand that this is also going to be one of your highlights in the future. Yes? Anyone asking? Mr. Albert Ho? Yes, sorry, I was late. So 3 minutes in. Okay. For questions that have been answered, please be brief. So are we going to be like Singapore's Temasek, so that we can invest in some infrastructure projects? For example, it's like the airport authority. So is it going to be like that? Have you considered that as a direction? Because in a community, there have been a lot of such suggestions. Well, I think the working group has not mentioned how the fund is going to operate in the future. They've just brought up this idea for the administration to consider. And what we can see is that one of the merits in setting up this future fund is that if it has a longer-term investment horizon, then it will be able to make longer-term investment. It will not be bound by 1 or 2 years. So it can afford to have longer-term investments. And apparently, this direction will have its merits, because if you're talking about a longer-term investment, then the return in the longer term will be better. But then as to what projects or investment items should it be working on, we do not have any view for the time being. Okay, if members have any suggestions, please bring that up with the administration. I'm sure the administration will be all ears to all suggestions. All right, we have spent enough time on this, so I think we'll wrap up our discussion on this, and thanks to the administration team for coming. Next, we have this briefing on the proposal for open-ended fund companies, initiatives to develop the asset management industry, as it involves legislative amendments. All members of the council have been invited, and we have got this discussion paper number CB bracket 1 1180 bracket 05. And the administration has also tabled a brief document or a PowerPoint here for us to consider.
咁唔好意思，因為頭先嗰個議題咧都係
Sorry, just now we overran a bit on our earlier discussion items because members were very concerned about this. So let's invite the administration team to brief us, and please be brief. So get ready. So you may start once you're ready. Yes, members. We'd like to brief members on a proposal for an open-ended fund companies, initiatives to develop our asset management industry. I'll use a PowerPoint to brief members. Our idea is that we should make the best use of our advantage as an investment asset and management center, because if you look at our motherland's development, there is also a momentum for driving our economic growth. And if you look at our unit trusts and mutual funds portfolio, they're actually looking for opportunities for portfolio assignment or allocation, and we have got more opportunities. And if you look at the financial market in our market, it continues to liberalize, and that would also give rise to many opportunities for Hong Kong's unit trusts and mutual funds sector to develop. And in recent years, there has been very good development in the sector, whether or not we are talking about SFC authorized unit trusts and mutual funds. And if you look at the total asset under management, the total value has also grown. And also for Hong Kong domiciled funds being authorized by SFC, well, in the past 2 years, the growth was standing at about 61%, so it's very substantial. And we are actually talking about over 300 such funds, and the ratio has been growing steadily. And on this occasion, we're trying to introduce this new fund format, and the purpose is to increase our leading status as an international asset management center. That would also broaden the variety of funds for investment. And if you look at our observation, well, we are mainly a distribution center, and we play a very dominant role in that area. And for Hong Kong funds, actually in terms of the design, production, and also marketing, most of these funds are working in Hong Kong, and as a result, that would also enhance our economic performance and job opportunities. So what is an OFC, an open-ended collective investment? Well, it's a form of investment scheme, but then it's an open-ended form of investment, so it can be in a corporate form, so it will be established in the form of a company, and it's like other companies. There would be limited liabilities, and there would also be variable share capital.
Well, as an investment fund, it will be managed for the benefit of shareholders, and we need an additional legal structure to complement the existing unit trust structure. The new OFC may be set up as a public or private fund, and the shareholders do not have day-to-day management rights or control over the underlying assets. However, they have the right to participate in the income or profits arising from the management of and transactions in the fund property via distributions. And OFC shares are typically priced at net asset value. What are the benefits of OFCs? Of course, it is more flexible, and compared with the current companies incorporated under the company's ordinance, there is variable share capital. There will be a lot of flexibility, and many of the restrictions under the current OC will not apply to OFCs. This will facilitate shareholders to make application of redemption requests, because usually for funds there will frequently be redemption requests. However, OFCs will exist in corporate form and with limited legal liabilities. And for winding up procedures, we will allow OFCs to operate more flexibly, and the requirements will be simplified. So the termination procedures will be streamlined. And it's very common for other jurisdictions to have similar structures. Now about the proposed OFC structure. It's similar to ordinary companies. There will be shareholders, and will require an OFC board to be set up with less than 2 shareholders as the directors, to protect investors. And because OFCs are investment companies, we require day-to-day investment matters to be managed by an investment manager. And the investment manager has to be SFC licensed or registered for Type 9 regulated activity. And there should be an independent custodian for safekeeping of assets of the OFC. So that's the overall structure of an OFC. Regarding the investment scope, the proposal is to align with investment activities subject to licensing and regulation by SFC under the SFO, and that is trading in securities and futures. The fund operation, although it is registered as a company, OFCs have more flexibility compared with their ordinary counterparts in terms of variation of share capital. And we propose to allow OFCs to have different funds to facilitate their operation. But to enhance risk management, we hope assets of different constituent funds to be separated. So when there are problems with one fund, one sub-fund, we want to minimize the risks to other sub-funds. OFCs will be mainly regulated by the SFC and to be registered under OFCs or under SFO. So the structure will be simple, and the legislative framework will be mainly in the amended SFO and the new OFC subsidiary legislation. We'll have a full set of OFC subsidiary legislation for reference by the market. And just like other funds, SFC will issue OFC code for detailed requirements and operation. As I said, SFC will be responsible for reviewing applications and giving registration approval. When SFC is of the view that an application can be approved in principle, the company's ordinance will incorporate and register such an OFC. So it's just like a birth certificate for the OFC, and the company's registry will also undertake statutory corporate filings functions. In fact, all such procedures will be duly streamlined. All right. Once an OFC is incorporated, it will be subject to post-registration monitoring and supervision. For publicly offered OFCs, they are subject to all existing ongoing post-authorization requirements under the SFC handbook on, for instance, disclosure and asset management. So for termination and winding up, the procedures will be streamlined. If the OFC faces any financial difficulties, and if it has to be wound up, then the current procedures in the company's ordinance still apply. Because OFCs are for management, and investors may come across OFCs, and therefore we believe there must be investor protection measures. As I said, there will be an independent fund manager responsible for investment, and there will be a custodian to keep the assets, and SFC will also regulate the activities of the company. And there will be due requirements on disclosure. Different regulators are different, are responsible for different supervision, and I will not repeat these details. The market is quite concerned about the tax arrangements for OFCs. Our thinking is, for publicly offered OFCs, they will enjoy the same exemption as for public funds if it is privately offered with central management and control located outside Hong Kong. Then, under the current regime, it is also exempted from profits tax. However, if it is privately offered with the control and management located onshore, we will consider carefully the exemption or the extent of exemption, having regard to possible Red Cross implications. Lastly, we have just embarked on a 3-month public consultation to end at the 19th of June 2014, and then we will consider all the views received in great details before drafting the relevant legislation. So we have to amend the relevant legislation in order to implement these proposals. A bill will be submitted to the Council. Thank you. All right. 5 members would like to ask questions. I read out their names. Wang Kok-heng, Ron Lee Tong, Leung Sheng, Kenneth Leung, Christopher Zhong, and Albert Ho. 4 minutes each, okay? Mr. Wang Kok-heng. Chairman, I'd like to ask about tax arrangements. The administration says that our tax base is narrow. How come OFCs can enjoy exemption from profits tax? Regulators have to supervise the operation of OFCs, and we also have to protect investors. If OFCs are tax-free, is it fair? So that's my question. Anyone? Deputy Secretary? Thank you, Mr. Wong, for your question. There are 2 things. First, in my can you speak into the microphone, please? Oh, I'm sorry. Our fund industry, well, if our fund industry prospers, it will bring benefits to other professionals such as accountancy and other aspects. And also, in the long term, this will have overall benefits to our taxation. And in other jurisdictions, now for publicly offered funds, we're already providing tax exemption, and it's common for other jurisdictions to do this. I'd like to follow up. If OFCs are profitable, I think they don't mind paying profits tax. On the one hand, the government claims that our tax base is too narrow. And if such investments brings income, the important thing is for the OFCs to be profitable. If yes, they don't mind paying a little tax. Yes. Now, if we talk about profits from the OFC, now if the whole fund industry prospers, this will enhance the income of the whole industry. For such investment, if is prosperous and profit-making, a reservation about giving them tax exemption. All right, so I hope you've heard the view of the member. Mr. Ronnie Tong, any measure that can strengthen our position as a financial hub, I will support. There are a few funds domiciled in Hong Kong, but I don't think the number is too many. So with these measures, are we going to attract more funds, or we will attract more operators to set up funds in Hong Kong? I am concerned about the issue of profits tax. And OFC or company has to pay profits tax. I think this is a deterrent for companies to incorporate in Hong Kong. So what are your views? DS? In Hong Kong, as at end last year, we have 3,043 funds registered in Hong Kong. The growth is quite considerable, but still it is on the low side. So we want more more funds to be domiciled in Hong Kong. However, there are some constraints because such funds can only register as unit trusts in Hong Kong. Many fund companies don't want to adopt this approach. No, yes, I fully understand the technical issues, but what are the incentives to OFCs? I don't see too many incentives, and profit tax may be a deterrent. there are incentives. We've heard this message from the market. They want to have an alternative to set up funds in Hong Kong that is in the form of a corporate instead of a trust form. How is that different? Because in your structure, you still require a trust to be retained. No, it is really a custodian instead of a trustee.
So you mean unit trusts would be somewhat more costly? Well, that's the choice of the market. Some people would think that there is a cost by setting up a trust. That's a choice. And also in Europe and the US, in particular the EU, they are also more inclined to setting up a company. They are more familiar with such operations, and therefore they don't want to do something that they are not familiar with, and therefore that would offer some incentive. So if it's in the form of a company, then that would be attractive, and of course tax implications would be something that they will have to bear in mind. But then you have not addressed my point. So how are you going to deal with that? Are you going to offer them a tax waiver or what? Or if it's a public fund, as I said just now, well, given the fact that it's going to be in an open-ended fund company form, so if it's a public fund, then at present it's already exempted, and in the future it will continue to enjoy an exemption. But then if it's a private fund, that would depend. If it's centrally managed and if it takes place in Hong Kong, at present it's not exempted. But then what we are saying is we are now discussing with the IRD, the Inland Revenue Department, as to whether we can offer some form of exemption. But then that's very much under consideration. We want to come up with a better arrangement in order to attract more funds to be originated in Hong Kong. From my perspective, that's going to be the biggest problem, because for other funds, in terms of Elevorium, they have already paid tax through their transactions, and also for the individuals, if they get any benefit at all, they don't have to pay tax, because in Hong Kong we do not have asset growth tax or asset increase tax. But then if you're going to have that, then it may not be very attractive because you're going to charge them tax. Next, Lang Sing. Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I have to declare, because I'm also a director of a trust. Well, the sector should welcome this, because as a financial center, we would like to have more variety of goods. It's like a department store, and then if we have more competitive goods available, that's good. And you're going to regulate that, then that would also help us to develop in a more healthy manner. But then the sector would also like to balance it with regulation and investment protection. We believe that there should be a proper balance, or else if you over-regulate, that might give rise to too much pressure, and you might have wanted to expedite it, but then it can be counterproductive. And in terms of tax arrangement, I agree that the profit tax will have to be competitive, and if you increase profit tax, then everything will in the end come from the consumer, so the investor might not find it attractive. And in para 8 of the paper, I'd like to ask this. Apparently, you talk about the board of directors in the OFC, and they will have to be legally responsible for all the affairs of the OFC, and will provide an additional layer of oversight for shareholders. And the board doesn't have to be licensed under the SFO. So we are talking about independent or non-executive directors. So as a director, if they are sitting on the board, they may not have to deal with the day-to-day operation of the company. And here it also says that they do not have to get a license. Then how can they be held legally responsible for all the affairs of the OFC? So my inference is that in regulating it, what are you going to do in the future? And you also said that they should be supervising the operation on behalf of shareholders. Usually the board should be playing this role, and they also have the committees under the board which would be responsible for monitoring or overseeing the operation of the company. So my question is, when it comes to similar developments by the OFC, would they be somewhat different from other regular or normal companies in terms of the regulatory requirements? So can you answer this point first? Deputy Secretary. Yes. The requirement would be similar to a regular director. They also have fiduciary duty. And then for the details, I can defer to my colleague, Principal Assistant Secretary. Well, with an OFC, they are still very much OFCs. They are still very much companies. And then in the end is the board, which will be held legally liable for all things in relation to this company. And then they will also be operated as a licensed asset management company. But then in terms of the board, when compared to other board directors, they will also have to take up this fiduciary duty. So under the common law or under the company's ordinance, in terms of directors' responsibilities, they are the same. But then, in accordance with the proposal, well, directors do not have to be licensed. So that's the same for raw company directors. But then in a board, there is this general fiduciary duty. Well, as I just said, we'd like to enhance our competitiveness by developing this. So you will have to look at other jurisdictions with similar setups. Do they have similar requirements on the board of directors? Is this required by other regulators? Next, Kenneth Leung. All right, you're only proposing to introduce this OFC or the OEF. This is somewhat late, and when compared to other jurisdictions, for example, Luxembourg, Ireland, and in the UK, they've done it for more than 10 years now. So you're only introducing it a bit late. I doubt the cost effectiveness. I agree with what Mr. Ronnie Tong and Ng Leung Sing just said. Well, for the tax incentive, it should not just be kept at the same level as it is. You should actually have expanded it. So these are registered companies in Hong Kong, and if they are centrally managed and controlled, and for the profit derived in Hong Kong, and if you have to charge tax, actually you're actually driving them away. So you will have to have a more integrated anti-tax avoidance provision, so that for these OEF or OFC set up in Hong Kong, if they can derive profit in Hong Kong, then you would also have to relax the control over centrally regulated or central control. Then only then will you be able to attract other OEF set up in other jurisdictions to come to Hong Kong, because in other jurisdictions they've been doing this for 10-20 years. So why is it that if you're doing everything the same, why do they have to come to Hong Kong? That's my view and my suggestion. And the second suggestion is about stamp duty. You're not going to offer any exemption whatsoever. So you should talk to the IRD. Well, for the OEF, and if you say that all the transactions will have to pay stamp duty, then legitimately you can use issue and redemption to avoid all the stamp duty liabilities. So please don't try to come up with such hurdles. You're actually hurting yourself. So why don't you just exempt such OEF stamp duty on transactions? Because even if you do not exempt them, they can always use issuance and exemption and redemption to avoid all stamp duty liability. Why don't you just exempt them from the beginning? I've also heard from the sector. I've got some feedback from them. And Madam Chair, I'd also like to make this declaration. Well, I was a member of the Tax Committee of Alternative Tax Committee, and I'm no longer a member. And for the legislation that has to be changed, from what I've heard, so it should be the SFO. But then under the new CO, do you have to make any changes at all? Thank you. Deputy Secretary. Thank you. In terms of the tax regime, we have heard members' views and we will consider them. On the second point, with regard to legislative amendment, what we expect now is that we will have to amend the SFO, the Securities and Futures Ordinance, because there are many requirements that would not be applicable if they And if they have to follow the CEO, then it would be rather cumbersome, and therefore we would like to have a more streamlined approach, and that would be done under the SFO. So the authorization would be made under the SFO, and also we can use the subsidiary legislation, which is a comprehensive package, so that would be used as a tool for the market. So you don't have to touch the CO at all, or will there be a reference? I think you will also have to align that with the new regulatory regime, because you're talking about the company and also the legal person. You cannot afford not to touch it. Well, yes, most of the changes might be under the SFO, but then you will also have to think about the implication on the CO. Yes, we'll go back and think about it. And of course, we are still at a conceptual stage in terms of our consultation. We haven't really come down to the drafting of legislation. And do we have to make a corresponding change to the CO? We do not rule out that possibility. It depends on the law draftsman's view. Thank you. Next, Deputy Chairman. Thank you, Chairman. Well, as an international financial center, well, development in asset management is welcome. But then we are also worried that with this OFC setup, number one, in terms of the transaction of financial products, there is no profit tax and there is no asset tax, and therefore the performance would be somewhat better, and as a result, more investors will be inclined to buying these funds, and as a result, for the regular stock trading activities that would be affected, and as a result, our sector will be affected, and they would think that this is not a fair policy. And if you look at other jurisdictions in terms of stamp duty and profit tax, is it that other countries have also exempted those? Deputy Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Jiang. You're right. We have to look at other jurisdictions and their practices. That's why, in the course of the consultation, we will also be considering that. And of course, in some jurisdictions, they do exempt such duties, and we are very much aware of that. On the overall investment considerations, well, it's for the individual investors to consider their own circumstances, which products are more suitable for their needs. But then in our case, we also have to come up with investor protection or safeguards. So as I just said, they also have to have a professional investment experience, and there would also be professional custodians to look after the assets. And the SFC, in the past, for private funds, usually they would not be subject to the SFC's regulation. But once we have such OFCs, then even if they are private funds, the SFC, under the circumstances in the future, would also be able to regulate them and have some oversight over them. I'd like to ask, for these funds, does that mean that local intermediaries would also be able to join? And would you encourage them to get listing? If that is the case, then there would be higher transparency, and that would also be better for supervision, because if they are sold in banks, then the spread would be very wide, and banks will be making a lot of money. And if you're going to exempt them on profit tax and stamp duty, then the biggest price that we are going to pay is that when investors buy the funds, the spread that they will have to pay would also be very high. So have you considered that, and can a better balance be struck? Deputy Secretary, on the first issue, on whether or not stockbrokers can take part in running such OFCs and selling such OEFs, well, I understand that many brokers would also have this number 9 license. And if they also hold this number 9 license, then you can also, or type 9 license, then you can also set up OFCs and OEFs. So it depends on whether or not you have this type 9 license. And also for listing of such funds, it depends on whether or not such funds can meet the listing rules. Because under the listing rules, there are certain rules regulating the listing of funds. Yes, Albert Ho. On tax, towards the end of the PowerPoint presentation, the last slide said that public offers will be exempted from profit tax. What does that mean? So is it that all public funds will be exempted from tax? So that's your recommendation right now. I don't quite understand it. So what do you mean by this exemption? Well, for the investment of such funds, let's say if there is a premium. All right, you say that there is profit tax implications and you're exempting them. But then if it's a company in operation selling such funds, and if they make a profit, then this is just normal trading. So by exempting that, would that be problematic? So should there be a distinction between the two?
Yes. Oh, we will provide a written reply to Mr. Ho later, because it is rather technical. Now, if the income is mainly from investment in Hong Kong, we do not have any capital gain tax. Yes, if we don't have any capital gain tax, then there is no question of exemption. But if there are companies who trade frequently in OFCs, I don't think you should exempt them from profit tax. Earnings from the transaction of such funds. Yes, exemption. We can. Yes. For a publicly offered fund, there is exemption from profit tax. But I can follow up on your question later, Mr. Albert Ho. I'll try to see what is the question you have in mind. All right, licensing. That's for regulation. All right, you will consider the management and the fund managers, their qualifications and experience. You also consider their investment items. For instance, under the trust ordinance, you have permitted or authorized investment. What if we talk about investment with risks? Will you approve such investment? Do you have the concept of product due diligence? Or will they only be allowed to invest in items pre-approved and with low risks? Yes. I'll provide an overall reply and see whether Madam Choi has anything to add. Of course, we are now consulting the market. The thinking is OFCs can only invest in activities under the SFO or subject to licensing and regulation of FSC. So there is an investment scope. The regulation by SFC is based on this. Madam Choi? If it is a publicly funded OFC, offered OFC, then it will be subject to our requirements in the product code. For instance, risk diversification and risk management. We have disclosure requirements and others for compliance. If it is a privately offered fund, then the scope of investment must align with investment activities subject to the licensing and regulation of SFC. And there are also requirements on the fund manager's risk control. But there should be more flexibility if it is a privately offered OFC. It's my turn now. Ms. Yan was quoted by the media as saying that it will promote and supplement the mutual recognition of Hong Kong and mainland funds. I think this is being done, and assuming that it is successful. Now, I don't really understand the situation very well. It's just my guess. You will attract many funds to be domiciled in Hong Kong for offer on the mainland. Is it true? When there is a mutual recognition agreement, is it true that funds registered in Hong Kong can be sold on the mainland? Have you considered the implications on regulation? Is my understanding correct? Can you please clarify? Thank you, Madam Chair. Regarding a mutual recognition of Hong Kong and mainland funds, SFC and its counterpart on the mainland have come to some consensus on the technical issues, but we still need proper approval. So we cannot give you the details on the arrangements. I'm sure there are requirements on the composition and registration and requirements or scope of the funds concerned. With OFCs, now why do we have to launch this public consultation? It's because we have received interest from the market saying that they would like to have this form of fund incorporation in Hong Kong. Without it, it may not be so easy or convenient for them to do business here. So I believe with mutual fund recognition, it would help our fund industry a lot. And this new OFC regime will encourage more funds to be domiciled in Hong Kong. Thank you. Second round, we've only got one member. Any more? I draw the line after that. Mr. Kenneth Leung. Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, we talked about the structure of OEF. I have read the whole consultation document, line by line. The characteristics of OEF, can the DS tell us? How are we better than other jurisdictions in terms of the structure? And if the OEF is used for an umbrella fund, there can be self-funds which can be terminated independently without affecting other assets. This is a very good suggestion, but I'd like to know whether we're in line with other jurisdictions or are we more ahead? Madam Choi, thank you. Yes, the proposals for OFCs have taken fully into account overseas markets of similar structures, including the UK, Ireland, or England, and New Zealand. So our structure is more or less in line with these markets. Regarding our protected shells and sub-fund and protection over it by sub-fund structure, yes, I think we're similar to other jurisdictions. In 1997, the earliest version launched in the UK did not have protected cell regime. And now, as a start, we have already adopted a protected cell structure. All right, our structure is just the same as other markets, and yet we have lagged behind. Please consider the tax concessions I proposed to you. Otherwise, it will be just like the Islamic bond. It is launched, but with a little business. You may want to attract more funds to be domiciled in Hong Kong to widen your tax base. I'm afraid that without my proposals, you won't be able to achieve that objective. I hope you've heard the members' proposal. Yes, noted. It's just the beginning of the public consultation. We welcome views from members. Yes, this is a new structure, and this is a message from the market that they want very much to have it in Hong Kong. I hope that shows that they are interested in using Hong Kong as the base of their funds. Thank you. All right, we end the discussion of this item here, and we move on to proposal briefing on the proposed regulatory regime on stored value facilities and retail payment systems. Again, we have overrun, and I will be stricter in time management. Because this item involves legislative proposals, all members of the Council have been invited to this discussion. We have got paper CB1180/1314-07 from the administration. And we've also got a PowerPoint presentation. DS is also your item, so when you are ready, you can start the presentation. And please be brief so that we can have time for members to ask questions.
好，請開始，秘書長。
主席。Yes, you may start now. Yes, the topic is the proposed regulatory regime for stored value facility, or SVF, and RPS in Hong Kong. Well, under our legislation, our regulations only apply to a device-based SVF, such as Octopus Card, and the Clearing and Settlement Systems Ordinance sets up the legislative framework to migrate the multi-purpose stored value regime to another regime. However, we have also got non-device based multi-purpose stored value products, and that can be done on the internet or by mobile device, and we believe we need to enhance our regulation to ensure the safety and soundness of SVF and RPS, to ensure public confidence and to promote our development and to ensure our financial services infrastructure. And therefore, in this year's budget, the FS announced that in the next legislative session, we are going to introduce relevant legislative proposals to the Council. Perhaps I should give the floor to Mr. Lee of Hong Kong MA to give us a briefing, the framework we have in mind. Thank you, Mr. Lee. First, our legislative approach. Under the Clearing and Settlement Systems Ordinance, or CSSO, we have a very sound framework for supervising a large value our SBF. We would like to include RPS as well. In CAP 155, our banking ordinance, we have a framework to regulate multi-purpose store value card such as Octopus Card. We want to expand it to cover SVF which are not device-based. That is, they do not appear as cards, and that would cover SVF on the internet or in mobile devices. there are two objectives under the framework. There are prepaid SVF. We have to ensure the safety of the float, and we have to consider the security and safety of issue. So we propose a licensing regime. All issuer has to be licensed by the Hong Kong MA before they can launch SVF in Hong Kong. Issuing SVF without a license will be a criminal offense. And for single-purpose SVF, no license is required under the proposal. And examples are, if the issuer is also the supplier of the commodities, so they regard it as a bilateral prepaid agreement, and they do not constitute a multi-purpose SVF or e-money in other countries. So single-purpose SVF do not have to be licensed.
And in other jurisdictions, this is also not regulated. We also propose that we should exempt some very narrowly based store value facility, and they would be providing this in their own premises or in the surrounding areas for the use of it. And the products that would be subject to this would be very limited. For example, in some oil or petrol refilling stations, or right next to it, you may have a grocery store where they can buy some snacks and limited types of products. And also for banks, under the BO, we have already got this licensing requirement, and therefore banks do not have to apply for another license, because banks have already been covered as licensed or authorized institutes. But then there are certain regulations that banks will also have to comply with. So in terms of licensing criteria, I'd like to say a few words on this. Well, for these issuers, they will have to set up a company so that there would be a body corporate under Hong Kong law. So that is to target some of the virtual companies. So they need to have a Hong Kong office so that the HKMA will be able to exercise effective supervision. And the principal business must be the issuing of SVF to ensure that the principal resources of the licensee will only be used on this SVF business. And in terms of their financial requirement, the minimum strings would be 25 million Hong Kong dollars. That is in line with the current arrangements for the multi-purpose store value card regime under the BO, and also for the management of float. That is one of our major targets. We will have to safeguard the users. So number one, the float will have to be completely segregated from the other funds, and they will also have to have a very sound regime to safeguard the float, so that where they need to use it, they'll be able to use it very efficiently. And also, the float must be kept separate from the issuer's other funds, so that users will be able to retrieve that very efficiently. And also, on the fit and proper ownership and management, we have this fit and proper ownership requirement, and that would also have to be vetted by the HKMA, and also for system security, internal control, and so on. These are also part of our licensing requirements. Next, RPS, retail payment system. The biggest difference is that under an RPS, there is no storage of capital, and there is no account whatsoever to keep such funds. So the purpose of the RPF is to facilitate the movement of funds from one account to another account. So that's the sole purpose. And therefore, by RPS, we are covering several types: credit card schemes, debit card schemes, large merchant acquirers, and also payment gateways that are very popular online. And also under the CSSO, we have already got this designated or designation regime, and the HKMA can designate that there are certain large RPS which will be covered. And we have this suggestion with regard to such designation regime. It could be expanded so that certain RPS can be covered. And the definition of such system, if it meets the requirement of retail payment system, then the HKMA will be able to consider that under 3 directions in determining whether or not they should be covered by this new regime. Where there is any hiccup, if it poses any threat to Hong Kong's financial stability or monetary stability, or whether or not there would be adverse effect. And also public confidence in payment systems or financial system of Hong Kong being adversely affected, or the day-to-day commercial activities in Hong Kong being adversely and materially affected. So long as one or more of these are affected, then we will cover the system under our regime. And we also talk about the SVF. Usually they also have a payment system to support its operation. Well, for the SVF, as it's already covered by a licensing regime, and at the same time, if there is a payment system, we will not be designating it at the same time because we don't want to have duplication in our regulation. But then, if it's a payment system, and at the same time, if it's not just serving its own tools, if it's also serving other payment systems and also other industries, then we will consider whether or not they should be designated. And once an RPS is designated, then we will look at the security of the system, risk management, and also the integrity of information within the system, soundness of the system, including financial soundness, and so on and so forth. So we do have a very effective monitoring or regulatory regime. And in order to do that, to put the SVF and RPS under our system, we will have to come up with new powers, and we propose that relevant provisions of the BO should be used so that the HKMA could conduct on-site examinations and off-site reviews, gather information from from those being regulated, and it can also give directions, impose operating rules, make regulations, and even issue guidelines and practical guidance and so on. And the second major area is that we will be making reference to the SFO Cap 571 and also Anti-Money Laundering Ordinance, the AMLO Cap 615, so that the HKMA will be empowered to conduct investigation into SVF licensees and designated RPS when the HKMA has a reasonable cause to believe that an offense has been committed. We also propose that the existing sanctions under the BO and the CSSO be used as a basis for sanctions under the proposed regime. For example, the HKMA can issue warnings, reprimand, and even require remedial actions or impose fines or multiple sanctions, so that could achieve a deterrent effect, so that the regulated will be operating their businesses properly. And at the same time, we also have to have some checks and balance against the HKMA's powers, and therefore we propose that under the Clearing and Settlement Systems Appeals Tribunal, well, at present the Appeals Tribunal will deal with appeals involving large amounts of money. We propose that it be expanded so that it would also be able to deal with SCF and RPS, so that if the licensees do not agree with the decision by the HKMA, there will be this redress avenue. Transitional arrangements, if the law is enacted smoothly, then we propose that there should be a transitional period of 12 months because there are some existing SVF issuers, and therefore they can migrate to the existing user accounts to a new account structure. So there should be a grace period during which they can do so that there would not be chaos. Finally, on public consultation and the way forward, the HKMA actually in early 2013 conducted a consultation with the sector. Several dozen issuers, suppliers, and some trade unions and some institutions have been asked to give their views on the regulatory regime, and we have also been able to collect many useful suggestions, and that has also been reflected in a consultation paper in May last year. The administration conducted a 3-month public consultation exercise, and some 40 submissions were received from different sectors of the community. These included individuals, institutions, issuers, trade unions, and different stakeholders. So with these very good suggestions, we have incorporated them in the bill, and we are now doing the law drafting, and our target is that in the 2014-15 legislative year, we'll be submitting the amendment bill for this council to scrutinize. So much for my presentation. 3 members would like to ask questions. Anyone else? I'd like to distribute the time. Sin Chung Kai, Wong Kwok Hing, and Kenneth Leung. So I'll draw a line there. 4 minutes each. Sin Chung Kai. Madam Chair, I welcome the amendment to the law that would enhance the users or consumers' protection. My question is also on online payment system, because many systems are international or cross-boundary systems, and therefore it may not be as what you said. They have physical offices in Hong Kong, but then if you look at their activities, in particular, well, they might be international or mainland-based companies. Well, on the mainland, they also have their own online payment systems. Well, they may not have an office anywhere because Hong Kong's market is a very small market to them. So in those circumstances, how are you able to regulate them? Are you going to exempt them, or are you saying that they are beyond your reach and therefore you will not be able to do anything about it at all? Who is to answer the question? Mr. Lee. Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Well, in this regard, if we're talking about SVF, then we will require them to have a physical office in Hong Kong. Well, if they are doing that online, and if they do not have an office in Hong Kong, and if they are trying to tout for business in Hong Kong, then they will be banned from doing it. So we will say that, well, you're banned from doing it because you don't have an office here in Hong Kong, and if they continue to do that by ignoring the ban, then we will look at their home country's jurisdiction and also the regulator in their home country, and then we will inform the regulator there, saying that this company has unlawfully solicited business in Hong Kong, and if they still do not take heed, then in government's notice and so on, we would call upon the public of Hong Kong. We will tell them that this SVF has not been licensed in Hong Kong, and they are not supposed to run any business in Hong Kong, and if you use them, then you will run into high risk. So we'll be resorting to all ways and means to ensure that if they are doing this SVF business in Hong Kong, then they will have to have an office in Hong Kong. They cannot just do it on a virtual basis. So when you talk about touting or soliciting business, it's sometimes very abstract. Will that be defined in the law? If so, how are you going to define that? Because by touting for business, well, I understand that, well, when it comes to different businesses, the service provider, unless they say in their system that they will be excluding Hong Kong as one of the places that can use the service, or else they would just provide the service anywhere anywhere the service demand is from. So how can you do it? So this is a virtual world. How can you prevent it from expanding? Well, we will make it very clear. If they engage in such business in Hong Kong, they will have to subject to our regulation. And if they are doing it in Hong Kong, then very likely they will require some local companies to help them in providing certain services in Hong Kong. So even for those companies providing these services to these online SVF, and if this SVF is not licensed in Hong Kong, then these companies, when they provide services to such SVF, then they will also be in trouble. Well, I can cite some example. All right. Well, by making the payment, it can be rather international. They can also provide the delivery service through certain couriers. So you might say that the SVF is not regulated, but then for the courier service is still in Hong Kong, and therefore you can regulate them, right? Well, you talk about the delivery service or courier service. All right, if they are doing it online, and if they make use of an online SVF, and if they are not licensed in Hong Kong, and if they indeed provide such delivery service, then the courier will also be prosecuted. Next, Wong Kwok Hing. Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a few questions for the administration. Number one, on the $25 million capital share, that is the financial strength requirement. So that is the paid-up capital. I am concerned that when it goes insolvent, then what happens? Next, about protection of personal data privacy. According to your briefing, you're completely silent on that in the past. For the Octopus card is an e-currency or e-money. Well, they try to sell personal data to other companies. It stirred up a major incident. Now it has stopped such practice. So for such online SVF, how are you going to ensure that they would not be leaking personal data to other commercial entities for profit? Who is to respond? Mr. Lee from the HKMA. Yes, thank you, Mr. Wong, for your question. On the first question on companies becoming insolvent, first, we have to look at the SVF and the business nature. Basically, it's helping the customer to make the payment, so the float is with them. And we are not concerned about such companies going insolvent. You will have to ensure that there will be smooth operation. We will not just be looking at the $25 million paid up capital. That's the long-standing minimum capital requirement. The most important thing is once we have a float placed in the SVF, they are prepaid. We do have a very stringent monitoring requirement.
We require that amount to be separated from other assets of the company, and that there is a safeguard to satisfy the Hong Kong MA that the float is very safe and it cannot be spent on high-risk activities. So we are not worried about this. So long as a company complies with our regulatory requirements, then there are special arrangements for float management. It is subject to very stringent supervision. And as regards personal data privacy, now the regulatory regime focuses on safety and efficiency. By safety, we talk about safe operation of the system. And we also talk about the personal data of customers. They should be subject to a high level of security, and the companies cannot use the information for other purposes unless with the consent of the customers. SVF is mainly for payment. The company cannot use customers' data for other purposes, and we regulate the regulation. We will also regulate this aspect as well. I hope you can include protection of privacy in your regulation, because you did not cover that in your briefing. Yes, you said that safety covers the protection of personal privacy. I hope that that can be really included in the framework. And I also support the requirement of having a physical business address in Hong Kong, because this will ensure that the authorities can strictly monitor or supervise the operation of the issuer. Mr. Kenneth Leung. Yeah, there is also the exemption. According to the DS, single-purpose SVF are exempted. But by single-purpose, can you elaborate on this? How is it defined in the legislation? For a group, it may issue SVF for its group of companies. The SVF can be spent in various retail outlets of the group, and it can also, for instance, the group runs a travel agency. The SVF can be used to pay tour expenses. That being the case, is it still a single-purpose SVF? And I'm also concerned about Bitcoin. I understand when I met with Mr. Norman Chen, I understand that Hong Kong MA doesn't regard Bitcoin as a currency, and therefore there is no need for it to be regulated by this proposed legislative framework for SVF. The regulation of Bitcoin will mainly be for anti-laundering purposes, money laundering purposes. Yes, I know. This is also the global trend. Is my understanding correct? Will you cover Bitcoin as well in your proposed amended legislation? Mr. Lee? Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Leung, for your question. We have considered the question of single purpose SVF very carefully. Well, there are many such SVF, such as those issued by bakeries, and in fact, when you give a deposit, when you make a suit, well, that can be regarded as a single-purpose SVF. So if we cover single SVF, then many common items will be subject to a regulation when they are just for very simple commercial operations. And Mr. Leung asked about SVFs being issued by a group which runs several companies, and that will be defined as multi-purpose. Still, even though it is a multi-purpose SVF, we only talk about a very limited range of commodities, then it can be exempted. And in a university, a student SVF can be multi-purpose. It can be used in the canteen or for purchase of souvenirs. It is certainly for multi-purpose, but it can only be used in the university campus, and it's likely that the card will be exempted if the group operates a diversity of business activities, then the card may be regarded as a multi-purpose SVF. Regarding Bitcoin, it doesn't fall under the definition of SVF or RPS. As Mr. Leung said, it is not defined as a currency. It's just a virtual commodity. It is not. The issue is not supported by any physical or substantive economy, and because the amount is so big, it can't really be used as a medium of exchange because of the big fluctuations in value. We will not regard it as an SVF or RPS. But as mentioned by the administration on several occasions, members of the public are reminded of the great fluctuations in the value of Bitcoins. Using it as an investment tool is very risky. And I think we have reminded the community or investors many, many times. Thank you. And with no legislation to regulate Bitcoins, but for anti-money laundering legislation, whether it is a Bitcoin or not, it doesn't matter. Thank you. I think we end the question time here, because this is a legislative proposal, and the administration aims to propose a bill to the Council in 2014-15. I'd like to ask whether members have any objection to this. So we're all agreeable. Right, then we end the discussion of this item. AOB, our last item. If there is no AOB, then the meeting is adjourned.